Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we enter a world where the spotlight glowed golden, but the silence behind it echoed with pain. She was the voice behind one of the most enduring country ballads in American history. She stood by her man in song and in life, even when doing so nearly destroyed her. Tammy Wynette, the so-called First Lady of country music, lived a life drenched in applause, sequins, and radio hits. But what if behind every soaring note was a hidden bruise? What if the smile, so familiar on stage, was masking a life quietly unraveling behind closed doors? She died, they said, peacefully, on her couch. But questions remain about her final years, about the man she was with, about the pain she carried until her last breath. Was it devotion or control? Strength or survival? And why, decades later, are people still questioning how Tammy Wynette really died and who she became before the world stopped listening? Tonight, we pull back the curtain, not to judge, but to understand, to listen closely, not just to her voice, but to what it was trying to tell us all along. Ladies and gentlemen, Tammy Wynette was not just a singer. She was a symbol, a silhouette in sequins, a woman with a voice so aching, so unmistakably wounded, that you didn't just hear her, you felt her. Born Virginia Wynette Pugh in 1942, she came from the Mississippi Delta, where hard work and hardship were indistinguishable. Raised by her mother and grandparents after losing her father at less than a year old, young Tammy knew early on that love and loss often walked hand in hand. Before she ever stepped onto a stage, she had been a hairdresser, a single mother, and a fighter. Long before fame arrived, the resilience was already there. When she finally made her way to Nashville, she wasn't polished, but she was real. And country music, at its purest, doesn't want perfection, it wants truth. And Tammy Wynette had that in spades. Her breakthrough came in 1967 with "Your Good Girl's Gonna Go Bad," but her 1968 anthem, "Stand By Your Man," seared her name into history. The song became a lightning rod, praised as the ultimate declaration of love and loyalty, criticized by feminists as a message of submission. But to Tammy, it was simply a reflection of the world she knew, messy, flawed, but full of feeling. She would go on to have 20 #1 hits, including "Divorce," a song that turned a simple spelling into a portrait of heartbreak. Her voice, high, slightly tremulous, but unshakably honest, made every lyric sound like a confession whispered through tears. Audiences adored her. They saw in her a woman who hurt like they hurt, who kept loving even when it broke her, who sang about pain not from a distance, but from inside it. Her stage presence was delicate, almost fragile, but her delivery, devastating. She didn't just sing heartbreak, she embodied it. She married 5 times. Each marriage added another scar, another song, another layer to the myth of Tammy Wynette. Yet, somehow, her public image remained intact, elegant, loyal, a survivor in rhinestones. She stood alongside George Jones, both musically and matrimonially, creating one of the most iconic duos in country music. Their harmonies were pure magic, their chemistry undeniable, but their personal life was anything but romantic. More on that soon. In the eyes of the public, Tammy Wynette was always strong, maybe too strong. No one questioned what she endured to keep that image alive. But behind the legend was a woman deeply wounded, a woman who spent decades trying to balance public reverence with private torment. And the deeper we look into her story, the more we begin to see just how thin the line was between love and captivity. Ladies and gentlemen, the stage was always hers, but was the life? Ladies and gentlemen, Tammy Wynette sang of loyalty, but her life was stitched together by heartbreak. Beneath the velvet gowns and polished stage lights was a woman clawing her way through a battlefield of broken promises, turbulent romances, and years of emotional exhaustion. She was married 5 times, but it was her third husband, George Jones, the possum himself, who brought both extraordinary musical partnership and relentless personal chaos. Their union was, at first, electric. George, the honky-tonk legend with a voice made of whiskey and fire, and Tammy, the emotional powerhouse who made sorrow sound like salvation. Together, they were royalty. They recorded hits like Golden Ring and Near You, and on stage their chemistry felt effortless. But off stage, the reality was far more harrowing. George Jones, brilliant as he was spiraling. He battled severe alcoholism, disappearing for days, missing performances, and flying into rages that left Tammy terrified. There were rumors of violence, of screaming matches that shook the walls. Tammy later recalled, "Living with George felt like walking through a minefield. You never knew when something would blow." They divorced in 1975, but the scars remained. And with every public appearance, Tammy kept her composure, her posture, her perfect Southern smile. It became a performance within the performance, being Tammy Wynette. But even after George, the pain didn't end. Her 4th marriage was brief, forgettable. Then came George Ritchie, her 5th and final husband, a songwriter and manager who, at first glance, seemed like a savior. He took control of her career, her finances, her schedule. For a woman exhausted from years of chaos, maybe that control felt like peace. But over time, something darker crept in. Close friends noticed Tammy becoming more isolated. She stopped returning calls. She became visibly thinner, weaker, almost ghostly in interviews. And the physical ailments began to stack up. Abdominal pain, repeated surgeries, hospital stays. She was prescribed heavy-duty painkillers, Dilaudid, Demerol, and more. By the early 1990s, some claimed she was taking medication around the clock, administered and managed by Ritchie himself. Tammy once told an interviewer with a half-smile, "He gives me my shot every morning." But behind the nervous laughter, there was fear. Was it love or control? Her daughter, Georgette Jones, born from her union with George Jones, would later speak out. She recalled how her mother was kept at a distance. "We weren't allowed to visit freely. Everything had to go through George." In her memoir, she wrote of a time when her mother cried on the phone, whispering that she was in pain and felt trapped. Then the line went dead. George Ritchie insisted everything was fine. He told the press that Tammy was simply fragile, that she needed protection from stress and outside noise. But fans noticed the change. Her skin grew paler, her voice thinner, her eyes emptier. In April 1998, just days before her death, Tammy collapsed. She had been sick for weeks. Still, she didn't go to the hospital. George said she refused. Others aren't so sure. On the morning of April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette died in her sleep on a couch in her Nashville home. Ritchie announced her death as peaceful, citing a blood clot in the lungs. But what followed raised more questions than answers. There was no autopsy, no toxicology report, no official medical examiner, no answers. Just a private funeral and silence. Georgette, her daughters, and many longtime friends were stunned. None had been consulted. None had been allowed a final goodbye. It wasn't until a year later, under growing public pressure, that Tammy's body was quietly exhumed. A private autopsy was performed. The results? Inconclusive. But what lingered wasn't just mystery, it was outrage. Fans felt robbed. Family felt pushed aside. The woman who sang for millions had seemingly died under the control of one man, with the world watching and doing nothing. In one interview, a close friend said, "We were all afraid to say it out loud, but everyone knew something was wrong." Ladies and gentlemen, the tragedy of Tammy Wynette wasn't just her pain. It was how well she learned to hide it, how fiercely she protected the very people and systems that hurt her, and how, in the end, the truth may have died with her. Ladies and gentlemen, Tammy Wynette may have left this world under a cloud of silence, but her voice still echoes, not just through her songs, but in the legacy she left behind. In the years that followed her death, the pain didn't vanish, it only evolved. Georgette Jones, her daughter, became the most vocal advocate for honoring her mother's truth. She spoke openly about the isolation Tammy faced, about the suspicion surrounding George Ritchie's control, and about the unanswered questions that still haunt the family. And yet, even through the heartbreak, Tammy's artistry remained untouched. Songs like "Till I Can Make It on My Own" took on new meaning. No longer just stories of love and loss, they became reflections of a woman surviving within a system that often suffocated her. For all the sorrow she endured, Tammy never stopped singing. Even when she was weak, even when she needed oxygen tanks off stage, even when her eyes were tired and her hands shook, she walked out and delivered. Because music wasn't just her career, it was her release, her rebellion, her refuge. Her fans knew this, and they never left her. In 2010, a bronze sculpture of Tammy Wynette was unveiled in downtown Nashville, not far from the Ryman Auditorium, the sacred home of country music. It shows her in her prime, microphone in hand, eyes turned to the sky, ready to sing. It doesn't show the pain, it doesn't show the bruises, but it does show what she gave the world and what it took from her. Years later, George Ritchie would die without ever answering the questions so many had asked, and perhaps he never would have. But the truth, like Tammy's voice, has a way of rising, even from silence. Ladies and gentlemen, Tammy Wynette may have sung "Stand By Your Man," but in the end, she stood by something far greater. She stood by the music, by the story, by every woman who ever felt unseen but kept going. Her legacy isn't just in chart-topping singles, it's in every tear-streaked lyric, in every woman who whispers her songs at night, in every person who has ever loved too much and lost too deeply. This is not the story of a tragedy. It is the story of a survivor who turned sorrow into anthems.
Ladies and gentlemen, We've heard her songs. We've memorized the choruses. We've sung along to Stand By Your Man at weddings and DIVOCE through Heartbreak. But how often did we stop to wonder what she was really trying to tell us? Was Tammy Wynette asking for understanding or crying for help? She was a woman who gave her soul to music, yet may have lost her voice in her own life. She built a stage from sorrow, but was that stage also her prison? When a life ends quietly, behind closed doors, with no questions asked, what gets buried with it? The body or the truth? Dear viewers, do we, as fans, as listeners, have a responsibility beyond applause? Do we owe the legends more than statues and platinum records? Do we owe them the dignity of asking the questions no one dared to ask when they were alive? And more than that, how many women today still live like Tammy, beautiful, beloved, and bruised beyond the music? There is no easy conclusion, no one truth, just echoes of her voice, her strength, her pain. Tammy Wynette gave us her life in 3-minute intervals, wrapped in steel guitar and sorrow. Now we listen back not just for the melody, but for the meaning. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not just a story. This was a woman, a mother, a survivor, and perhaps a warning. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, not just about Tammy, but about every voice we've lost to silence. Until next time, this has been Whispers of Country.